As long as the government and the state institutions fulfilling its duty toward the Syrian people.
On the 8th of December 2024, Syria experienced a political shockwave when the Assad dynasty collapsed after decades of oppressive rule. Inside the presidential palace, chaos erupted as looters stripped the place bare, taking possessions belonging to Assad and his wife, Asma. Rebel fighters searched through the remnants of the tyrant's life and uncovered personal photos that hinted at a hidden truth. Why did Assad's reign end so suddenly, and what drove him to flee his country? What secrets lay buried within those photographs? Join us as we delve into the dark history of Assad and uncover the mysteries of his family's rule. Family photos of Assad found in the presidential palace. Assad ruled Syria with an iron fist for 24 years after the demise of his father, Hafez, a life anything but normal. The family tried to maintain a middle-class persona. However, they kept their extraordinary wealth under wraps through various fraudulent accounts, shell companies, and offshore tax havens. Assad's wealth is estimated to have been in the billions, something on show as rebel groups have spent days pillaging his palaces. However, amid the golden chests, mementos from world leaders, and supercars, rebels, while sifting through the deposed dictator Bashar al-Assad's lavish palace, came across the bloody tyrant's family photo albums. What was discovered inside was staggering. Thumbing through the private collections, they found baby snaps, wedding photos, and pictures of the tyrant looking awkward in his underpants. These photo albums in Assad's palace offer an invaluable insight into vile Assad. The intimate and candid photos reportedly discovered in albums from Assad's mansions in the hills of Damascus and Aleppo offer a stark contrast to the polished, glamorous image that Assad and his father projected as they led Syria for half a century. They also found a bizarre array of belongings that the overthrown leader and his wife left behind before fleeing to Russia. It is all creepily normal for a family who oversaw the brutal demise and torture of thousands of innocent civilians. Before we uncover the content of these photographs, let us briefly check Assad's early life before becoming president and how he married Asma. Early life and marriage of Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad was born on the 11th of September, 1965, in Damascus, Syria, as the third child of Hafez al-Assad, a Syrian military officer and member of the Ba'ath Party, who in 1971 ascended to the presidency via a coup. The Assad family belonged to Syria's Alawite minority, a small sect of Islam that traditionally constitutes about 10% of the Syrian population and has played a dominant role in Syrian politics since the 1960s. Bashar received his early education in Damascus and studied medicine at the University of Damascus, graduating as an ophthalmologist in 1988. He then served as an army doctor at a Damascus military hospital and in 1992 moved to London to continue his studies. Assad was a London-trained eye doctor, but his older brother Basil al-Assad, dying, soon thrust him into the political spotlight. In 1994, his older brother Basil, who had been designated his father's heir apparent, lost his life in an automobile accident. Despite lacking military and political experience, Bashar was called back to Syria, where he was groomed to take his brother's place. He trained at a military academy to bolster his standing with the country's powerful military and intelligence agencies. Eventually, he gained the rank of colonel in the elite Republican Guard, preparing him for future rule. Hafez al-Assad also sought to engineer a positive public image for his son, who until then had lived out of the public eye. Bashar was placed at the head of a popular anti-corruption campaign that resulted in several officials' removal but ignored senior regime members' dealings. His image as a modernizer was burnished by his appointment as chairman of the Syrian Computer Society. Bashar met his now wife Asma Akras, a former investment banker at J.P. Morgan in the United Kingdom. They got married in 2000, the same year Assad suddenly inherited Syria's dictatorship following the demise of his father. The couple share 3 children born in 2001, 2003, and 2004. Presidency. Hafez al-Assad passed on June 10 in 2000. Hours after his demise, the Syrian parliament amended the constitution to lower the presidential age requirement from 40 to 34, Bashar al-Assad's age at the time, enabling the younger Assad to assume power. On the 18th of June, 8 days after his father's passing, Assad was appointed Secretary General of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and 2 days later, the party Congress nominated him as its candidate for the presidency. The national legislature approved the nomination. On the 10th of July that same year, running unopposed, Assad was elected to a 7-year term. Although many Syrians objected to the transfer of power from father to son, Bashar's ascent engendered optimism in Syria and abroad. His youth, education, and exposure to the West seemed to offer the possibility of a departure from the status quo, an authoritarian state policed by a network of powerful, overlapping security and intelligence agencies, and a stagnant state-run economy reliant on shrinking oil reserves. In his inaugural speech, Assad affirmed his commitment to economic liberalization and vowed to carry out some political reform. However, he rejected Western-style democracy as an appropriate model for Syrian politics. Assad returned to entrenching the regime as he announced that he would not support policies that might threaten the dominance of the Ba'ath Party. He slightly loosened government restrictions on freedom of expression and the press, and released several hundred political prisoners. Those early gestures contributed to a brief period of relative openness, dubbed the Damascus Spring by some observers, in which public political discussion forums emerged and calls for political reform were tolerated. Within months, however, Assad's regime changed course, using threats and arrests to extinguish pro-reform activism. Afterward, he emphasized that economic reforms would have to precede political reforms. By 2005, Assad had used a series of cabinet reorganizations and forced retirements to sideline members of the old guard, powerful government and military officials held over from his father's administration. Younger officials replaced them, and many of the most powerful security positions went to his relatives. However, even after this consolidation of Assad's power, his reform initiatives remained tentative and largely cosmetic. Economic liberalization mainly benefited a politically connected elite without helping the many Syrians who depended on the faltering public sector for employment, services, and subsidies. In 2007, Assad was re-elected by a nearly unanimous majority to a second term as president, through elections generally received by critics and opponents as a sham. In his second term, he took tentative steps toward ending his country's international isolation, seeking to mend relationships with regional powers, including Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Assad, who succeeded his father as president of Syria in 2000 and served until 2024, when he was toppled after 13 years of civil war. His fall came despite early hopes that his presidency would usher in an era of democratic reform and economic revival. He largely continued his father's authoritarian methods, and his attempt to repress the uprising against his rule included brutal tactics, most infamously, the use of chemical weapons. The family's liberal fame was short-lived and quickly collapsed as Assad began a brutal saga of torture and bloodshed against Syrians. He wiped out the opposition groups in the city of Homs. This sparked the Syrian civil war, which ended the lives of 500,000 people, while 6 million were left as refugees. Before the bloodshed, Assad appeared happy and was pictured smiling and laughing with friends and family. The tyrant also looked to have enjoyed partying with friends in his youth. What was the civil war like? And what oppression did the people of Syria face during this period? How did the civil war end? Keep watching as we unveil more details. The Tishreen Palace, the former home of the Assad family, symbolizes the Assad regime to some extent, grandiose on the outside but neglected within. While the Assad family enriched themselves by hollowing out the country's remaining assets and producing an industrial-scale party drug called Captagon, they made a fatal error. They didn't look after the soldiers charged with their protection. It was apparent from the swift collapse of regime forces as the rebels advanced that Syria's government was already crumbling. During his regime, when the civil war happened, soldiers were reportedly poorly paid and poorly fed at abandoned army bases filled with outdated, neglected vehicles. Their hastily abandoned uniforms, boots, and equipment lie on the roads beside their former posts. No one seems to be touching these symbols of the hated regime. Assad's army has been reduced to little more than a hollow shell after a 14-year war that ended the lives of more than 500,000 people, displaced half of Syria's pre-war population of 23 million, and devastated the country's economy and infrastructure. The police posts and checkpoints that were part of Syria's network of repression were roughly cheaply built, sometimes using sticks and rocks or old barrels and tires. Regime tanks, very old Soviet models, sit damaged and abandoned on the roadsides. Tanks like these, as well as barrel bombs of high explosives, were used to bombard the city of Daraya, south of Damascus, after it became a base for the Syrian opposition. While the massacre of Daraya happened 12 years ago, evidence of this horror was found everywhere. Daraya was initially famous for holding peaceful anti-government protests, but later became known as one of the worst affected areas in the civil war. First came the Daraya massacre in 2010, one of the seminal events of the conflict in which pro-government forces, including Iran-backed militias like Hezbollah, were accused of going from house to house and murdering hundreds of people. Then followed 4 years of intense bombardment until an agreement was reached to let anti-regime rebels and their families leave. Whole sections of the city were flattened and remained in ruins. An entire street of multi-story apartment buildings was gutted, with a few families living amongst the wreckage. Hussam Makia, who worked in a photo shop when the war began in 2011, talked about the incident in an interview. When the revolution started, each person chose their way. My mission was to document my city through images and convey this vision to the world. Hussam was one of those who went to the northern province of Idlib, still held by rebels. When the government regained control in 2016, we had to hide from the regime as we knew it would target us directly. It would spare no one, he said. Daraya was besieged. They attacked the city with all their weapons. It is almost a miracle that young men from Daraya survived this massacre. It is hard to describe my feelings. I don't have words to tell you how I felt when I entered the house and saw my mother after 8 years. My life stopped. I felt like I was reborn. I had imagined that after we had left, the regime would have rebuilt the city, he said. I saw Daraya destroyed during the siege. After I had left, I thought life would have returned and infrastructure would have been fixed. When I came back, I found none of that. It was just identical to the Daraya I had left. Now, with Assad's regime gone, he has returned with his wife and daughters to his family home. Another similar story affected during the civil war was the city of Ghouta, which was bombarded with chemical weapons in 2013 during the Assad regime. We were sleeping when suddenly people were shouting chemical. It was chaotic. No one knew the treatment. Maher Bakura, who lived close to the impact sites, told the American Broadcasting Company. Multiple international investigations determined rockets filled with deadly sarin gas were dropped on this part of Ghouta, as well as conventional explosives, claiming the lives of hundreds of people. Sarin is one of the most toxic poisons ever made, with even a small dose enough to make people seriously ill. A powerful nerve agent, it shuts down muscle control, making people convulse, pass out, and die. Poorly resourced local hospitals struggled to treat those affected, as staff did not know what chemical had been used. Medics responding to the attack said victims were foaming at the mouth and had turned blue from suffocation. We had hospitals operating with basic material. Children and women lost their lives at home, and a great number of medics who came to rescue people passed away as well. Nobody knew what to do. The strangest thing was that the people brought to the hospital were not treated, as the few doctors available at the time had no clue about how to treat people, Mr. Bakura said. Mohammed, another resident, said his family suffered greatly in the bombardment. In these 3 buildings that were hit, around 70 people lost their lives. Around 39 and 40 people were my relatives. Others were longtime neighbors and friends, he said. One of the rockets remains in an apartment, the hole it punched through the ceiling not yet repaired. Those responsible for the Ghouta and Daraya attacks have not yet been held to account, but residents are pleased they are no longer in power. We are happy because all this blood was not wasted. The blood of the martyrs, the innocent people, women and children who were unarmed at home and were targeted with these chemical weapons, Mohammed said. Another brutal act during the Assad regime was the unlawful arrest of the Syrian people, who were kept in the most feared place in Syria without accountability. Syrians are still finding out just how many people lost their lives to the regime. The government structure of overlapping security services, hidden detention facilities, opaque processes, and extortionist practices left many families not knowing what had been done to relatives who were arrested. In Sednaya, the military prison known as the human slaughterhouse is the most feared place in Syria. Desperate crowds searched the facility for traces of their family members, combing through documents spread across the floor, benches, and tables. What is this inhuman behavior to throw people in prison and leave them without any accountability? Citizens questioned. Lawyer Ammar Abara, one of those detained in Sednaya's red section for 5 days in 2017, is now gathering documents to catalog who was kept in the prison and what happened to them. I am collecting evidence. Many people have disappeared, and their families know nothing about their fate. Maybe someone was in Sednaya, and he was murdered or freed, he said. Human rights groups estimate thousands of people were either executed or lost their lives from the torture and neglect at Sednaya, one of at least 87 detention and torture facilities operated by the Syrian regime, according to the United Nations. Sednaya military prison is where the Syrian state quietly slaughtered its people. The victims were overwhelmingly ordinary civilians who were thought to oppose the government. Dr. Yaman al-Hussein, who was among those visiting the prison, said Sednaya was one of the most feared places in Syria, whispered about by people who survived it or their friends and relatives. Somebody told somebody, who told somebody else, like a story, like parts of a puzzle, he said. That was part of the strategy, to make Syrians afraid even to voice any criticism of the regime, lest they be denounced and disappear into the system. The prisoners are all under the sand. They are suffocating. Generators used to bring them fresh air, said Ahmad, who was searching for his father. But those digging only found rocks and dirt. Experienced rescue teams had already declared the prison was clear, and there were no hidden chambers, but desperate families searched. Relatives waited around the grounds, sleeping on mattresses and blankets beside fires. Many people hoped their family members had been released and have not contacted them. Yesterday, I saw my brother getting out on social media, but we don't know where he went, one man said, showing a video. I saw him on Facebook, and I came here to check the source of this video. I don't know where he is. I had no news from him for 8 years. I hope that God punishes this regime and that God does not forgive them. I hope God does with them what they did to our children. Many relatives said they were victims of extortion, unable to pay off Assad regime officials to keep their loved ones out of prison. After years of civil war, mass surveillance by secret police, reprisal murders, and disappearances, there is a tentative hope for the future. Damascus is considered the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, and it was once known as the Pearl of the East. However, before they can rebuild, Syrians must pick through the wreckage of what the Assad's administration wrought, revealing the true extent of its repression and brutality. How did the Syrians end Bashar's reign? Keep watching as we delve into the details. End of Bashar's reign. The Assad regime ruled Syria for more than 50 years under Assad and his father, Hafez. Assad's rule over Syria ended dramatically in December 2024, after rebel forces stormed Damascus in a surprise offensive, forcing the dictator to flee to Russia. Rebels captured Damascus in a lightning campaign, declaring the capital free and marking the end of years of brutal authoritarian rule, including chemical attacks, mass detentions, and the decimation of Syrian cities. Syrian rebels, led by former al-Qaeda splinter group, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, managed to end Assad's rule in 10 days. Weakened by a lack of support from his pal, Russian tyrant Vladimir Putin, the fighters stormed toward Damascus, and with no other choice, Assad was forced to flee, leaving behind his family mementos as they ran for their lives. They piled onto a private jet, switched the transponder off, and headed to Moscow. He is believed to be potentially hiding in a luxury apartment block owned by the family as Putin shelters him. Assad left aboard a military plane amid rumors of its crash before resurfacing in Moscow. It comes as an apparent Russian conspiracy to distribute false news about an al-Assad aircraft accident has been exposed. The Ukrainian Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security claimed on X that Russia hid their trail in assisting al-Assad's escape by circulating fake claims that he died in a crash. Meanwhile, opposition forces took control of key cities, toppled Assad's statues, and announced plans for a transitional government. The fall of Assad deals a blow to allies Russia and Iran, with both withdrawing assets from Syria. The stunning collapse of more than 53 years of al-Assad family rule has been described as a historic moment, nearly 14 years after Syrians rose in peaceful protests against a government that met them with violence that quickly spiraled into a bloody civil war. Assad's name will forever be tied to some of the worst war crimes of the modern era. The man once seen as a modernizing reformer will be remembered instead as a symbol of unchecked brutality. His legacy is wholly written in the blood of his people. The story of Bashar Assad's downfall is a reminder of how corruption, power, and greed can destroy a country. Now that the Assad regime has forcefully ended after years of oppression from Assad and his father, what is the hope for Syria? After seizing Damascus in a swift and decisive offensive, rebel forces declared victory and announced that the city was free of Assad. Thousands poured into the streets in the capital, waving rebel flags and lighting flares. Statues of Assad and his late father Hafez have been toppled in symbolic acts of defiance. Syria hopes to offer a better future for its children. Ordinary Syrians continued to celebrate the end of the rule of Assad, whose family's 53-year dynasty was brought down in a 10-day offensive. The armed wing of the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, which brought down Assad, has said it would form a transitional government soon. HTS has promised to set up an inclusive government that protects the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, and has won praise from Syrians so far for prioritizing stability and service provision. There is nothing worse than what Assad did. What HTS are doing so far is so great. Izam Barake, a demonstrator on the street in Damascus, told the American Broadcasting Company, "They are making it free. Now we are finally free, now there is hope. And now, every day, Syrians celebrate and grapple with rebuilding their broken nation." Syrians have been fascinated by the background glimpses of a seemingly normal family that ruled the country and bombed some of their fellow citizens regarded as a threat. The sharing of photos had become an extension of the dazed first hours after Assad's ouster, when Syrians wandered the presidential palace and its disheveled signs of a rapid departure every day. For many Syrians who had endured forced imprisonment, displacement, and oppression under the Assads, the photos serve as a spectacle and a chance to exhale, even laugh. One photo shows Assad's father, Hafez, striking a bodybuilder-like pose in his underwear. Other images show Bashar Assad in a Speedo flexing his biceps, astride a motorcycle in his briefs, and staring blankly in a kitchen, wearing underwear and a sleeveless undershirt. What is it with the Assad family and being photographed in their underwear? Highly interested in knowing the fantasy behind it, journalist Hussam Hammoud wrote on X. In the photos, Syrians can see the ophthalmologist in Assad, not the leader. In one, he's on a balcony teasing a girl sitting on his shoulders. In another photo, a young Assad places a ring on his wife's finger. In a third, he's seemingly taking a selfie. Social media footage also has shown Syrians touring the Assad's opulent estates, revealing extravagant decor and possessions out of reach for many who have lived through the country's civil war since 2011. Sky's Dominic Waghorn, one of the first foreign journalists to be given access to the Assad family home, reported that inside Asma's storage room and boudoir were mementos abandoned in a hurry, presents the children had made at school, family photographs of the Assads on holiday, underwater photos of the tyrant of Damascus swimming and windsurfing, and countless boxes for jewelry, antiques, and designer goods. This was clearly where the dictator's British-born wife Asma loved to be, her inner sanctum where she stored her treasures. On the lower floor, envelopes of damning documents. Among them were bank records in Asma's maiden name for staggering sums of money. In interviews, the First Lady of Syria insisted the Assads lived a middle-class life. Few were fooled, but the extent of that fraud became clear. As the First Lady of Syria, Asma, who never wore a burqa or a veil to cover her face, left a lasting impression of an independent woman on the world stage. According to The Telegraph, she even told a friend that she was the real dictator in the family. However, what was seen revealed the life of luxury she and her family led, while her husband was orchestrating the murder of hundreds of thousands of his people who were living in abject poverty. Fueled by decades of persecution and a desire for vengeance, people have stripped the mansions of valuables and further exposed Assad's private world. Many of the pictures discovered by rebels show Assad half naked, either in boxers or sporting a humiliating pair of budgie smugglers. Another showed Assad lying down with one of his children, who looked to be a newborn, on his chest. It's hard to imagine from the pictures that it is this dictator who has left behind a shattered nation. He decimated Syria's infrastructure, fractured its society, and plunged millions into despair. He appears to have learned lessons from his also tyrannical father. The photographs of the day Asma and Bashar got married were found on one shelf. She looked adoringly into his eyes. He had brought her to Damascus from her life in London to a new one in Syria, a life that brought her untold wealth, fortune, and power, but ultimately saw her forced to flee the country in disgrace. What are your thoughts on the Assad regime and the contents of the family photos found in the presidential palace? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. You can also explore the other videos on your screen.